Happy New Year! Have you ever had someone that you didn't get along with? How did that make you feel? Have you ever thought about the future? What do you think you will look like? Where do you think you will live? God's people, the Israelites, might have had some ideas about what their future would look like, but only God knew for certain what was ahead of them. Today, we will find out what happened when Solomon turned away from God, the only one who knows the past, present, and future. As you might remember, we have been talking about birds this month, specifically owls. I want to make you aware of something owls do when they eat their food. They swallow it whole. Well, at least the smaller food, like rodents and birds. Obviously, there are parts of that kind of food that owls can't digest. Fur, bones, feathers, and teeth. So all that stuff gets coughed back up in a tight ball called an owl pellet. Scientists can look through these owl pellets and find out what an owl ate. Sometimes they can even piece together a whole skeleton. I'd like to tell you one more story from the Bible about King Solomon. What one word would you use to describe Solomon? When I think of King Solomon, I think of the word wise. But as we will see in our story today, Solomon wasn't a perfect king. He made some pretty foolish choices, and the result was something that went from one piece into more than one. Kind of like what happened to the animal the owl ate. First, can anyone remember our big picture question? I hope you can. That's right. What does God know? Let's all say the answer together. God knows everything about the past, present, and future. Something surprising happens in today's Bible story. Keep in mind, it wasn't surprising to God. Because what does God know? God knows everything about the past, present, and future. Exciting things were happening under Solomon's reign. God had given Solomon wisdom to lead the Israelites. We can read some of Solomon's wisdom in the Bible. Check out Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. Israel experienced a time of peace, and God led his people to build a temple where he would dwell with them. God made a promise to Solomon. If Solomon would obey his commands, then God would keep his promise to live among the Israelites and to not leave his people. Today's Bible story is called The Kingdom Divided. Uh-oh, that doesn't sound like something that would happen to a king who obeyed God's commands. Listen closely to find out what happened.
King Solomon loved God, but he did not love God with his whole heart. Solomon had hundreds of wives, and many of them were from other nations. Solomon's wives turned him away from God, and he began to worship the false gods that his wives worshiped. God was angry. God said to Solomon, "Since you have done this, I will take the kingdom away from you. You will be the king the rest of your life, but when your son becomes king, he will lose everything except for one tribe."
When Solomon died, his son Rehoboam became king. The people told Rehoboam, "Your father, Solomon, made us work too hard. We will gladly serve you if you make our work easier." Rehoboam thought about it and asked his father's friends for advice. "Be kind to the workers, and they will work for you forever," they said. But Rehoboam ignored that advice.
He asked his own friends what he should do. Rehoboam listened to his friends and told the workers, "My father did not make you work hard enough. I'll make you work even harder. The people did not want to serve a king like Rehoboam, so they made Jeroboam king. Jeroboam had been one of Solomon's officials. Now he was king of the northern kingdom of Israel. Only one tribe remained under Rehoboam's rule, and that was the southern kingdom of Judah.
Rehoboam did not like being king of only one tribe. He planned to attack the northern kingdom of Israel, but God sent a prophet to stop him. The prophet had a message from God. Do not fight them. The people of Israel are part of your family. I am the Lord, and I am in control of what is happening. So Rehoboam went home.
Now, Jeroboam was the king of Israel, but he wasn't a good king. When the people of Israel traveled to Jerusalem to worship God at the temple, Jeroboam worried that they would start thinking of Rehoboam as their leader. So Jeroboam made 2 golden calves and told the people, "Going to Jerusalem is too difficult for you. Here are your gods who brought you up from the land of Egypt. You can worship them." What Jeroboam did was a sin. Those calves did not lead God's people out of Egypt. God led his people out of Egypt. Jeroboam led all the people to worship the false gods instead of the one true God.
King Solomon failed to lead God's people perfectly. God's people needed a better king, a perfect king. Through David's family, God would send his own son, Jesus Christ, to be a perfect king over God's people forever. Jesus is greater than Solomon. Jesus brings his people together and leads them back to God.
Today's Bible lesson comes from 1 Kings chapters 11 and 12. God divided Israel into 2 kingdoms because Solomon sinned. The 2 kingdoms were named Israel and Judah. Can you guess why Israel was called the northern kingdom? The tribes in the northern part of the land made up that kingdom. The tribe of Judah was located in the southern part of the kingdom. Can you guess what it was called? The southern kingdom. Solomon's son, Rehoboam, became the king of the southern kingdom, Judah. Jeroboam, one of Solomon's officials, became the king of the northern kingdom, Israel. Did Rehoboam and Jeroboam worship and follow God? Well, Jeroboam built false idols for the people to worship instead of guiding the people to worship God. The Bible tells us later in the book of 1 Kings that while Rehoboam was king, the Israelites worshiped false idols. So Rehoboam wasn't a good leader either. God's people needed a leader who would lead them perfectly, a leader who would lead them to worship and follow God always. They needed a leader to lead them back to God. Had God given up on his people? No. What does God know? God knows everything about the past, present, and future. Through Rehoboam, God graciously kept the promise he made to David, that his kingdom would last forever. As we just saw, King Solomon failed to lead God's people perfectly. God's people needed a better king, a perfect king. Even though Solomon was not faithful to God, God was faithful to keep his promise to make David's kingdom last forever. Through David's family, God would send his own son, Jesus, to be a perfect king over God's people forever. Jesus is greater than Solomon. Jesus brings his people together and leads them back to God. We learned that Solomon was not faithful to God. But what was it that caused this to happen? Why did Solomon turn his heart away from God? Could the same thing happen to us? Pastor Brian answers that question in our Questions from Kids video today. Let's listen to what he has to say.
Hey there, I'm Pastor Brian, and it's time for Questions from Kids. Daniel from Wilmington, North Carolina asks,
Does it matter how often I go to church? Will God be mad at me if I'd rather stay home?
Daniel, thank you for asking that question because I think you're not the only one who asks that. You know, today's Bible story really gives us some insight to how we can answer that question though. Because today we saw that Solomon's heart was not completely devoted to God, and that got him in great trouble. Over time, he just gradually abandoned God. He walked away from God, stopped worshiping God with all of his heart, and that's why God disciplined him. And here's what matters. Here's what we have to see. God was upset because Solomon's heart was not right. Solomon had walked away from God in his heart, which caused him to walk away in his actions. And so your question, does God care that we go to church every week? What happens if I don't want to go? Well, here's the thing. I need to take that into two parts. The first one is, does God care if I go every week? God is not keeping some cosmic scoreboard. He's not keeping track of every time you're there and for how long and so forth. It's not about that. But that second part of the question, I think, is where we have to camp out. That I would ask you, why don't you want to gather together with the church? Why don't you want to go and worship God? That's what God cares about. You see, because if we love God, if we are grateful for what He's done for us, then we should want to gather together with other believers and worship Him on a regular basis, understanding there are times that we can't make it to church. There may be times where we're sick, there may be times where we're traveling or so forth. But in general, our heart posture should be one of wanting to be part of God's church, worshiping with other people who love God like we do. So here's a question for you. How can you show your love for God this week?
Like Pastor Brian just said, God doesn't have a scorecard where He's keeping track of when we miss church. But we do need to consider why we don't want to go to church, or why we don't mind missing gathering with others to worship God. We talked a little bit about this last week. When we worship God together, we encourage each other to keep doing right and good things. When we don't come together to get and give encouragement, it's easier for Satan to target us and discourage us and turn our heart from God. What are some ways that you can show your love for God and others this week? This is our last week with this key passage. I hope you have been working on learning it. Let's say it together. If any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, and it will be given to him. James 1:5. When we trust in ourselves and follow our own plans, we make foolish decisions. Remember these words from James 1:5 whenever you need wisdom. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord. All the families of the nations will bow down before you, for kingship belongs to the Lord. He rules the nations. Psalms 22, 27, and 28. Earthly kings will fail us. God sent his own Son, Jesus Christ, to be a perfect king over God's people forever. He deserves our praise. Well, it's a new year with new opportunities to love and serve God and others. Be thinking of ways you can do this, and then do it. Next time, we will be starting a new quarter. I wonder what will happen to the Israelites next. Join me to find out. Have a great week.